the first thing people remember is not the sound of the gunshots, it's the silence that followed. In the dusty streets of Dar es Salaam, long before the world understood what was happening, a small crowd had gathered around the body of a woman dressed in a deep purple cloth. She was 3 months pregnant. She had been just running when the bullets found her. Neighbors say she was the only breadwinner for her husband and 2 young children. The way her body lay across the pavement, the way no one dared to move her at first. It was the kind of moment that tells you a country has crossed an invisible line, one it may never return from. Not far from there, another scene unfolded in quiet desperation. Young men were taken to a wide patch of earth, the soil freshly turned the air thick with fear. They later told investigators they had been ordered to dig the ground for something they did not want to believe: mass burials. When satellite images eventually confirmed disturbances in that exact spot, the world could no longer pretend nothing was wrong. For a while, Tanzania's leadership insisted the death toll was exaggerated, that the unrest was temporary, that everything was under control. And then with just a 5-minute investigation, CNN's Larry Madowo stepped into the frame and nothing was the same again. His work stitched together geolocated gunfire, armored police units firing on unarmed crowds at close range, and families whispering about relatives buried in the dark of night. The kind of evidence that forces a nation to look at itself. But this raises the question many are now afraid to ask out loud. How did Tanzania, once seen as a pillar of calm in East Africa, reach a moment where truth itself became dangerous? If you believe that stories like these must be told fully, without fear, without silence, then stay with us. And if you value independent voices who follow the facts wherever they lead, please consider sharing this video or subscribing. Truth matters, especially when others try to bury it. Long before the world saw satellite images and geolocated gunfire, the story of Tanzania's unraveling began quietly, almost gently, in March of 2021. It was the day President John Magufuli died without warning. For many Tanzanians, it felt as though a curtain had dropped in the middle of a play no one expected to end so suddenly. And in that silence, a new figure stepped forward, his vice president, Samia Suluhu Hassan. Her rise was historic. The first female president in East Africa, a calm and measured technocrat stepping into the center of a storm. In those early days, people spoke of her as a bridge, a leader who could unite factions that had lived in tension for years. She moved swiftly, lifting bans on media outlets that had been silenced under the previous administration, allowing exiled critics to return and reassuring foreign governments that Tanzania was reopening to the world. Her message was simple but powerful. I can run the country the same way men did. Women can do it. Women can never fail. For a population exhausted by fear and secrecy, this sounded like a promise. And for a brief moment, Tanzanians believed it. But Tanzanian politics is not a story driven by personalities alone. It is a machine built over 6 decades of single-party rule under CCM, designed to maintain power at all costs. And like any machine, it reacts violently to anything that threatens its balance. By 2023, that machine began showing its familiar teeth. Journalists started disappearing quietly at first. Not all of them vanished forever. Some returned shaken and silent. Others simply never came home. Young people marching for a new constitution were pushed off the streets, beaten, detained, warned. Opposition gatherings were broken up with force. The hopeful glow that had accompanied Samia's early days began to dim, replaced by uncertainty, then suspicion, then outright fear. Still, Tanzanians held out hope that the 2025 election would bring clarity. But what came next was a sequence of events that told the country unmistakably that something had shifted. First came the return of opposition leader Tundu Lissu, a figure who had survived an assassination attempt years earlier. His arrival at the airport was supposed to symbolize democratic renewal. Instead, he was arrested almost immediately and charged with treason. His party was later removed from the ballot entirely. It was as if the political stage had been wiped clean, leaving only one actor at the center. As the election date approached, reports began surfacing of unusual movements around police barracks, of armed units deployed without explanation, of a government preparing for something far different from a normal democratic contest. The atmosphere grew heavy, the way the sky feels just before a storm. Then came October 29, 2025. Tanzania went dark, literally. The government cut off internet access for 3 full days, a blackout that left the entire population with no way to communicate, verify results, or even understand what was happening beyond their own neighborhoods. When the blackout lifted, the government announced an improbable victory, an 87% voter turnout and a 98% win for President Samia Suluhu Hassan. For many Tanzanians, the numbers were not merely suspicious, they felt like an insult. And in the streets, frustration ignited into anger. Crowds began gathering, demanding answers. Witnesses later described how security forces responded with live ammunition. Videos captured the crack of gunfire echoing through alleys and open markets. People ran in every direction, not knowing where to hide. The young, the old, mothers holding children, men trying to pull wounded friends to safety. It was in this chaos that the woman in purple, the pregnant mother, the breadwinner for her children, was shot while fleeing. Her death became a symbol of something far bigger, the unraveling of a nation's sense of safety. As the days passed, the testimonies grew darker. Young men claimed they were ordered to dig trenches near military barracks, trenches they feared were meant for bodies, not soil. Families whispered about loved ones who never came home. The opposition spoke of nearly 3,000 dead. The government admitted only some casualties. By the time the world turned its eyes toward Tanzania, the foundations of Samia Hassan's reformist image had already begun to crack. In the days after the election, blackout lifted, Tanzania's streets carried a strange kind of quiet one that never comes naturally to a nation of 60 million people. It was the kind of quiet that follows fear, not peace. People walked differently, spoke differently, looked over their shoulders as if danger had acquired a shape. And then, almost without warning, that quiet broke. The first gunshots were heard near a crowded market. No warning shots into the air, no tear gas, just bullets, fired at unarmed crowds who had gathered to question results that felt predetermined. Witnesses later described the terrifying precision-armed officers in dark uniforms firing at close range, choosing not chaos but control, not intimidation but elimination. Videos recorded on shaky phones captured the muzzle flashes, the screams, the stampede of civilians trying to outrun something no human body can outrun. Satellites would later see what the living were too afraid to approach: disturbed ground, freshly carved shapes in the dirt near multiple barracks. To most people, they were just patches of earth. But to those who had been forced to dig them, they were graves, wide, deep, hurried, built not for individuals but for many, built to erase. This was the moment Tanzania's crisis crossed from political tension into something darker, something the world has seen too many times in histories it prefers to forget. Still, the government insisted nothing was wrong, that only a handful of people had died, that opposition accounts of thousands killed were fabrications. But the facts were already beginning to betray them, and then came the spark that turned a national tragedy into a global reckoning. Larry Madowo stepped forward. For years, Larry had reported on African politics with the clarity of someone who understood the stakes personally. But this time, he carried something far heavier than headlines. He carried proof. His documentary began with a simple image: a wide expanse of soil freshly turned. It matched with chilling accuracy the testimony of young men who said they had been forced to dig sites for mass burials. From there, the investigation unfolded like a forensic puzzle. Every shot, every scream in the footage was analyzed, every frame geolocated, every gunshot cross-referenced with the signature sound profiles of known police armories. Larry's team traced the shooters to specific security units. They matched shadows on the ground to the shapes of surrounding buildings, confirming the exact time of day the violence occurred. They used satellite images to identify nighttime disturbances, vehicles arriving, shovels, moving bodies carried under cover of darkness. The evidence was clinical, cold, inarguable, and it enraged the Tanzanian government. According to insiders in Dar es Salaam, officials made a frantic attempt to stop the documentary from being broadcast. Phones rang through foreign embassies, letters were drafted, legal threats circulated, but none of it worked. Once the truth began to surface, it moved too quickly for suppression. International reactions followed with the force of a wave. The United Nations raised concerns about possible crimes against humanity, words rarely used lightly. The African Union declared the election neither free nor fair, an extraordinary condemnation for a region that often avoids confrontation. Tourism operators in Arusha, the heartbeat of Tanzania's safari economy, reported mass cancellations. Hotels emptied. Guides lost income overnight. Investors quietly began shifting capital into Kenya and Rwanda. Inside Tanzania's ruling CCM party, panic began to simmer. Senior figures whispered about Samia Suluhu Hassan's collapsing legitimacy. Some questioned her judgment. Others questioned whether she could hold power amid such scrutiny. A few speaking anonymously wondered if she even knew the full scale of the violence, or if someone else within the security apparatus had seized the moment to enforce brutally the old order. But outside those rooms in the streets, the reality was simpler and far more painful. Families searched morgues for missing relatives, mothers begged hospitals for information, survivors described bodies lying in open roads for hours because civilians were too terrified to retrieve them. A nation once seen as peaceful was now carrying the weight of unspoken trauma. And everywhere the same question echoed: how did Tanzania reach this point and who allowed it? By the time the government issued a single-sentence statement saying it was reviewing the report, the world already knew the truth. The story had broken open, the silence had been broken, and there was no turning back. For ordinary Tanzanians, the days after the violence felt like living inside a wound that refused to close. Mothers searched for their children in overcrowded clinics and dimly lit morgues. Fathers wandered police stations carrying photographs of sons who left home on election day and never returned. The smell of tear gas still lingered in the air long after the protests were over, and the sound of distant gunfire seemed to echo inside people's memories long after the streets had grown quiet. In many neighborhoods, families whispered about bodies taken away at night. Some spoke of trucks moving without headlights, escorted by armed personnel. Others described seeing shovels, mounds of dirt, and hurried digging signs that something was being hidden beneath the surface of the land. Even those who had not lost a loved one felt the fear settle into their bones, a sense that Tanzania had crossed a moral line it could not simply step back over. The civil consequences were immediate and devastating. Local businesses closed early or did not open at all. Markets, usually vibrant from dawn until dusk, fell half-silent as vendors feared being caught in crossfire or mistaken for protesters. Schools reported a drop in attendance, especially among older students who had been present at demonstrations. Parents kept their children home, worried that unrest might return without warning. At the same time, trust, perhaps the most fragile pillar of any society, began to collapse. People no longer believed announcements from government radio. They no longer trusted statements from police. Rumors traveled faster than official updates, and in many cases, people preferred rumors they felt closer to the truth. The psychological impact was even deeper. Survivors of the shooting spoke of sudden panic attacks, nightmares, and the inability to sleep through the night. Families of the missing lived in a painful limbo, unsure whether to hope or grieve. The young men forced to dig the suspected mass graves carried a silent shame, even though they had acted under orders. Trauma rippled through communities, touching even those who had not witnessed the violence firsthand. But the political consequences were equally powerful and far more visible to the outside world. Internationally, Tanzania's image shifted overnight. Only months earlier, President Samia Suluhu Hassan had been praised as a modernizer, a stabilizing force, the woman who could restore Tanzania's global standing after years of rigid rule. Now, those same foreign governments were questioning whether she had knowingly allowed state violence or whether she had lost control of the very institutions meant to protect civilians. The African Union issued a rare and harsh judgment: the election was neither free nor fair. For a regional body that often avoids direct confrontation with sitting governments, this was an extraordinary statement, one that signaled Africa itself could not ignore what had happened. The United Nations went further, raising concerns about potential crimes against humanity. The phrase was chilling, especially for those old enough to remember the darkest chapters of Africa's political history. Tanzania's economy, especially its tourism sector, suffered heavy blows. Operators in Arusha reported waves of cancellations. Safari companies that had relied on American and European visitors saw bookings fall dramatically. Investors shifted their portfolios toward Kenya and Rwanda, countries perceived as more stable. Inside Tanzania's ruling CCM party, pressure mounted. Senior figures began questioning whether Samia's leadership could withstand the growing scrutiny. Some worried that the scandal had permanently damaged the party's legitimacy. Others feared that further investigations, especially those led by international bodies, might expose truths too damaging to survive politically. All the while, the Tanzanian government maintained a defensive stillness. Officials refused to answer questions from CNN. Attempts were made to block the documentary, and the only public response, a short, vague statement saying the government was reviewing the findings, did little to calm the nation or the world. In the end, Tanzania found itself in a position no government ever wants to occupy: isolated internationally, shaken internally, and unable to rewrite a story the world had already seen with its own eyes. When the first images from Larry Madowo's investigation reached American living rooms, grainy footage of crowds running through smoke, the sound of close-range gunfire, the trembling camera that captured the woman in purple lying motionless, many older American viewers felt something familiar. It brought back memories of crises they had witnessed across decades: Rwanda in the 90s, apartheid crackdowns in South Africa, the early warning signs of state violence in places Washington once underestimated. And this time, the question for Americans was not just what happened, but how could it happen in a country the U.S. considered a stable partner? From Washington's perspective, Tanzania had long been viewed through the lenses of stability, counterterrorism, cooperation, and tourism-driven economy. Not perfect, but predictable. The kind of partner the U.S. relied on to keep East Africa steady. Samia Suluhu Hassan herself had been praised early in her term for welcoming back journalists and expressing openness to the West. So when the post-election bloodshed became undeniable, the United States found itself forced into a position it had hoped to avoid. Within the State Department, discussions reportedly shifted quickly from monitoring the situation to reassessing diplomatic posture. American officials, particularly those responsible for East African policy, were stunned by the scale of the violence and the precision of the documentary evidence. Questions surfaced about whether the U.S. had overlooked early warning signs or placed too much faith in a reform narrative that was convenient but fragile. For many American observers, the issue went beyond Tanzania. It signaled something broader, a growing crisis of democratic backsliding across regions where Washington had heavily invested in institution building. And in a world where U.S. influence is increasingly challenged by China and Russia, instability in East Africa is not merely a humanitarian concern, it is a geostrategic one. Meanwhile, Europe reacted with its own version of alarm. The European Union released statements expressing concern over human rights abuses, but behind closed doors, officials worried even more about economic stability. European tourists once filled safari lodges in Arusha and Zanzibar. Now cancellations poured in. Insurance companies raised risk profiles, and European investors, especially in infrastructure and energy, began quietly freezing new projects. Across Africa, reactions were sharper and far more personal. Countries that once avoided criticizing fellow governments felt compelled to respond. Kenya, Rwanda, Zambia, and even South Africa saw civil society groups demand investigations. In many African capitals, people asked the same painful question. If an election with 98% victory requires mass graves, what does that say about the future of democracy on the continent? Nations within the African Union watched closely, knowing that ignoring Tanzania's crisis would undermine the AU's credibility, especially at a time when African nations are trying to assert greater independence on the global stage. The AU's declaration that Tanzania's election was neither free nor fair reflected this pressure. But what shook the world most was the feeling that this tragedy was not just a Tanzanian story, it was a warning. A reminder that political decay rarely begins with explosions. It begins with silences, with disappearances, with governments that slowly grow comfortable using fear as a tool. For Americans, particularly older Americans who lived through decades of global upheaval, the lesson felt painfully familiar. Democracy anywhere is fragile everywhere. And Tanzania's crisis served as a mirror, showing what happens when institutions weaken, oversight disappears, and leaders become insulated from accountability. In the end, the world's reaction, whether cautious or outraged, revealed the same truth: the events in Tanzania had broken something deeper than stability. They had broken trust. In moments like these, when the dust has settled but the truth remains unsettled, a nation must confront not only what happened, but what allowed it to happen. Tanzania is now living through that painful reckoning. And for many who watched the violence unfold, one fear rises above all others. If this could happen in a country once praised as stable, where else could it happen next? The warning signs are all too familiar. A government cutting off the internet. An election declared before verification is possible. Opposition leaders jailed or silenced, reports of disappearances that never receive explanations. And then the ultimate red line: civilians shot while demanding answers, families forced to bury loved ones in secrecy, and authorities refusing to acknowledge the full scale of the tragedy. These are not just Tanzanian problems. These are the early cracks that have appeared in societies across the world, including some that Americans once assumed were immune to democratic decay. For older Americans, many of whom watched the world shift from the Cold War to the age of terrorism to the era of disinformation, what happened in Tanzania may feel like a reminder of something they have always known: democracy is never guaranteed anywhere. It requires vigilance, accountability, and a citizenry that refuses to be intimidated by power. And yet Tanzania's story is not only a cautionary tale. It is also a testament to the courage of those who chose to speak when silence was safer, journalists who risked their safety, families who shared testimonies despite threats, and ordinary citizens who stood in the streets demanding a voice. Even in the darkest chapters of history, truth finds a way to surface. Sometimes it comes from a shaky phone video, sometimes from a satellite photo, sometimes from a single journalist refusing to look away. Today, the world is watching Tanzania with a mixture of grief and disbelief. But tomorrow it may be watching another nation, and another after that. The lesson is painfully clear: no society is exempt from the consequences of unchecked power. So let me ask you, especially those of you who have lived long enough to see nations rise and fall, freedoms won and lost. What happens when people stop asking questions? What happens when truth becomes something leaders fear rather than defend? And what happens when the world looks away at the very moment it is needed most? Your voice matters here. Your perspective matters. If this story moved you or reminded you of a time when silence became dangerous, please share your thoughts in the comments. And if you believe, truly, believe that telling the truth about Africa matters just as much as telling the truth about America, please consider sharing this video. Subscribe if you believe that transparency is more valuable than headlines. And share if you stand with every ordinary citizen, whether in Tanzania, the United States, or anywhere in the world, who simply wants to live without fear.